I think it's kind of like Bruce Lee when he said, be water, my friend, because water always adapts to different circumstances.
And passion can be painful. Try to build multiple identities.
Hello, friends, and welcome to Wisdom Nuggets Unlocked, the show that brings you exclusive interviews with highly successful people in their respective fields who made a mark in their world. My name is David, and besides my own newsletter, Wisdom Nuggets, I'm a blogger and influencer and currently study law in Seoul, South Korea. With that being said, today our guest is really exciting. Our guest is pursuing his PhD in organizational behavior at Harvard Business School, and himself owns a successful psychology podcast. So with that being said, welcome to the show, Kai Krautter.
Hi, how are you doing, David?
I'm very fine. Thank you so much for joining our show today. I think many people are hyped because they saw the title, Harvard Business School, and many people, I think, have this image of Harvard as being the absolute excellence uni and university, and I believe it is. So maybe we can start by describing your life at Harvard University, as well as the process of getting into Harvard itself.
So right now I'm in Germany. So at the moment I'm working remotely for HBS, but this fall I will start as an incoming PhD student and will start my PhD studies there. And will probably be there for the next 5 or so-ish years. It's a great place to conduct research, honestly. And I think one very important thing to mention in the very beginning is that Harvard Business School in particular is famous for their MBA program. So a lot of people want to go there to do their master's degree. I'm not one of them. I'm a researcher, so I want to pursue my PhD there. But still, it's a great place to conduct research. However, there are also many other places where you can do a lot of amazing research. And I did my bachelor's degree in psychology at Saarland University in Saarbrücken in Germany, which is a comparably rather small university. But still, there were a lot of people who did exciting research there as well. So I guess at the end of the day, it's more about research fit than about the prestige of the university.
So why did you decide to go to Harvard University then?
I applied there for a research internship position, and then I was lucky to be accepted. But I think the main reason why I applied there is because there was great research fit with my advisor, Jan Jachimovic, and myself. Because Jan, he was studying passion for work and inequality at the time, which were two very broad topics that I was interested in myself. So I really focused on going deep into this topic of passion for work in the last 2 years. I think another reason is that I transferred from psychology to organizational behavior at the business school. And there's some differences between psychology studies at a normal university and being at a business school. And I think one thing that I find particularly attractive at a business school is that the research that we're doing there is very applied. So we're doing a lot of field research where we cooperate with organizations, and then we ask real people in real life settings about their behaviors at work, about their feelings, about their emotions, and so on. So I really like this applied context of a business school, especially because I'm interested in organizational research. And there are other advantages as well. Some of them are like the interdisciplinary nature. So in OB, organizational behavior, it's not just psychologists, there are also people from economics or sociology and so on. And then finally, I think one of the main differences between psychology and OB is that in OB, you're also interested in an audience that is broader than just academics. So if you write a paper for psychology, you're mainly writing it for other scholars or other people who are writing papers themselves, basically people in science and academia. But in OB, and maybe that's naive, I don't know, but we always have in mind a broader audience. So we are actually trying to have an impact on real life managers and real life employees as well.
How was the application process of getting to Harvard? I talked to some people who actually also wanted to go to Harvard University, and besides needing a lot of good academics, they said you need a lot of connections. What was your experience basically in that regard?
Well, that again depends on like what you're applying for. So it might be very different for an MBA or an undergrad if you're trying to do your undergrad at Harvard University or Harvard College. For me, with like the application for a PhD program, I think there are several aspects that are very important. One of them are grades and stuff like GRE scores and like standardized tests. And for me as an international student, also like the TOEFL test. But this is more about a threshold, I would say. So if you're like in the 1 percentile of best students, that doesn't give you a big advantage. On the other hand, if you're like very low on all of these tests, that definitely gives you a disadvantage. What I think is more important when you're applying for PhD positions, in my opinion, is the research experience that you have and the research interests that you have. So for me, it helped tremendously that I had 2 years of research experience after my undergrad, because it also helped me shape my research interest. One thing that I think people at top business schools, or maybe top schools in general, are looking for when it comes to a PhD is, do you have a clear sense of what you're trying to study? And are you a curious person in general? At least I hope that people were able to say yes to both of these questions for me, because I had these 2 years of research experience and had a pretty, or have a pretty clear sense of what I want to study in the next couple of years. And then finally, to your point with connections, well, that's a very tough question to ask because I have no idea. I can't really answer that. But I think one important aspect of PhD applications, or applications in general, are also letter of recommendations. So it's really important, like, who writes these letter of recommendations and what do those people actually write within these letters. I think because I had research experience at Harvard Business School for the last 2 years already, my advisor was able to write a letter of recommendation for me, but then also some co-authors that I worked on several projects. And I think probably that had a bigger influence that I might have expected in the beginning. Yeah,
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying it. I think a lot
of
of
course.
people are interested in that sense. Speaking of your research in the next
Mm.
5 years at Harvard, you want to specify on some questions, and I found these questions interesting myself. You talked about the stability of passion, or you want to conduct research in that regard, and when it is, for example, useful to grit and when it is useful to quit. And that's actually a very interesting question, especially in my field of studying law, for example, because it's a very long journey. And many of my friends from the first semester, they actually dropped it already and go a different path. So the path is getting lonelier and lonelier with each semester that's passing, basically. Honestly, I've asked myself this question as well. How do you determine when to keep pushing with your path, or when you should quit? Like, what is your thinking process when you have to deal with such a decision yourself?
That's a great question. I've just started thinking about it recently myself. Actually, that happened to me doing all of these PhD applications that I had over the last couple of months, when I was like rethinking everything that I was interested in. And so in our research, we always talk about passion. And I think one thing that I've learned in the last 2 years is it's not sufficient to just be passionate about something. You also need to like persevere. And then there's this famous psychologist, Angela Duckworth, and she introduced this concept grit a couple of years ago, which is basically passion plus perseverance. So in order to be successful, you need to have something that you're passionate about, but you also need to persevere. And if you have any challenges or setbacks, you need to go through them. And I think more generally, perseverance is highly valued in our society, right? It's something, it's good to be to stick through challenges and to do something over longer periods of time. And I guess you know that feeling when you're doing like a podcast. I do a podcast myself, and it's the first few episodes are great because it's a lot of fun, but then consistency is key. You can only be successful if you do it over longer periods of time. So in general, I think perseverance is awesome. However, and this is like the caveat that I would like to add, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that as well, is I think sometimes it's not good to persevere. It's these moments when escalation of commitment happens, for example. It's these moments where we do something, but actually we already know that it's probably not going to be successful in the long run, but we still stick through it because we invested a lot of time, love, energy, effort, all of these things into it already. So I think it's a great skill to have grit, but it's also a great skill to know when to quit.
I'm still curious because you said sometimes we have this inner feeling of, okay, we deep down we know that it is wrong, but I think it's not always like white and black like that. So
Yeah.
how would you recommend someone to pursue this? Like, would you write down the pros and cons of if you keep pursuing that path, or do you listen to your gut feeling, or yeah, what do you do?
I guess for me personally, with like the decision where to pursue my PhD, I had all of these spreadsheets, obviously, and I was like, oh, that's a huge pro, that's a con, and so on and so on. And then finally, I went with my gut and decided to go with HBS. But I don't think it's a bad idea generally, because while I was writing these spreadsheets, I was like changing them in ways that helped me make my decision eventually. So I was like writing all of these pros and cons. I thought, okay, no, that's not the order that I want to have. So I changed it again and changed the ranking and so on and so on. It was crazy. To your question specifically, I think it's key to know your values and things that you care about, because that's like your inner values. That's like your guiding point for many many different aspects. So if I say one of my values is helping other people, for example, or like communicating science to other people. That's probably the reason why I'm doing my podcast. However, if I keep doing a podcast for 3 years and I don't reach anybody, I cannot really fulfill that value of mine, right? I think I want to help other people, but it may be an illusion, and maybe I don't help anybody because nobody's listening to it. So I guess one very helpful thing are these regular check-ins between like what am I doing and what do I actually care about, and is there some discrepancy? Obviously, discrepancy is always there, and it's also probably not a bad thing. But if you can minimize that, I would think that's probably a good thing. Yeah.
Myself, I personally do a lot of journaling and just writing it down because I feel like in our head there are so many thoughts at the same time, and it gives you clarity if you write it down. So uh, I guess the same approach as you, but also listening to my gut feeling, because my gut feeling, I think it's a transmission of your deep and inner values. Like your gut is basically your subconscious mind, I believe, telling you if something is right or not. So I figured that in my experience, the gut feeling was right in many cases and instances. So I always take that into account as well.
And you said it's not always black and white, and I agree with that. But also, I think at the end of the day, it is black and white, because your gut tells you, oh, that's a good thing, or maybe, oh no, that's not a good thing. And then you might go with it, or you might not. But it's like always this feeling like, does this feel good or does it not feel good? And yes, it may be useful to listen to that, but also keep in mind that critting is very hard. I think if I invested a lot of time in my podcast in the last couple of years. I hope that it may be successful one day, maybe not, and that may be fine as well. But this aspect of admitting that maybe something that you've invested a lot of time, effort, and so on already may not be worth it, and that you may want to quit. That's actually very hard to admit. Your gut may know that before you do, but who knows? Maybe you don't listen to your gut when it's like really, really painful otherwise.
How do you differentiate your gut feeling from
Hmm.
just some sort of low in motivation? Because for some people, maybe they think it's their gut, but in reality, it's their mind, which is too weak and which is having the mindset of, oh, I just want to quit because this is actually hard. I actually know that it might be successful someday. Do you have a differentiation in that regard?
I love that question. That's one of the main research questions that I had in the last 2 years when it comes to passion. Because what is passion, right? Passion is first and foremost a very strong feeling for something that you care about. So it can be passion for work, as we study in a business school, but you can obviously have passions for lots of things. You can have a passion for your podcast, you can have a passion for playing chess, or maybe a passion for spending time with your partner. I think there's a discrepancy how we think about passion and how passion actually feels like in our society. So we always hear things like, oh, follow your passion, do what you love. If you do what you love, it doesn't feel like work anymore, stuff like that. And you know that because in Germany, passion means Leidenschaft, and so in English that would mean like the ability to suffer or something like that. And it already implies that passion is hard and passion can be painful, right? It's not easy to pursue your passion. You do something that you care about, and I would say almost by definition, people vary in their levels of passion. So on some days, I'm super passionate about everything that I'm doing. Let's say research. I love doing research. On other days, I'm super low on my levels of passion. It's like I know it's important to me, but I don't really like what I'm doing. I don't enjoy it, but I still have to do it, right? And these are the most important days, I would say, because without a passion, I would probably give up. I would say why should I write 3,000 tables for this paper? I don't know, maybe it's a huge waste of time, but because I'm passionate about it, I say, okay, it's still worth it. I don't enjoy it in this moment, but I know that because I'm doing it, I can carry it over to other more important tasks. And then I can zoom out and see, well, remember this value that I have helping other people. All right, I'm doing this task that I don't enjoy, but because I'm zooming out and think, oh, this is actually my passion, it helps me do it. We vary in our levels of passion. Sometimes we're passionate, sometimes we're not. We're not. And we need to recognize these moments where we're low in passion and then stick through it and then persevere. That's this grit. That's like the very first part of your question. I see that, but I also remember that you asked like, how can we differentiate it from, oh, maybe this is not my passion after all, right? And this is where it gets really hard. I don't have an answer to that. That's why I want to study it in the next couple of years. I think right now what I want to say is, if these days where you where you're not passionate about it, where you're very low in passion, are more frequent than the days where you actually really enjoy it. And it's like day after day where you're like, that's not my thing anymore. Maybe that's the right time to quit.
Yeah, I think so too. If your passion turns into every single day, you just have to put in all of your willpower to actually execute the task that you have to do, then it can potentially turn into a curse, I believe.
My main project in the last 2 years was actually about passion and burnout. So we were looking at these two variables in particular. I don't know, would you believe that people with a passion are they more prone or less likely to burn out?
I believe that without a passion, you're less prone to burnout because normally people who have a passion tend to do overwork, at least from my experience, I think. And these people are more likely to suffer from burnout. What does a Harvard student say?
I love that you say that. Actually, I'm not saying that. A lot of previous research said that actually the opposite of what you were saying. So if you're more passionate, you're less likely to burn out generally. However, however, in the project that I was doing with like all of my amazing co-authors, I can also send you the paper afterwards. We showed what you were saying. We show that okay, maybe in general, people with a passion really enjoy what they're doing, and it's like great, so they're less likely to burn out. However, on a day-to-day basis, and that's what I was talking about earlier with like these fluctuations, on a day-to-day basis, if you have a very high passion day today, you invest a lot of time into your work, you invest a lot of energy, and especially a lot of like, you put your whole identity into your work, and you don't switch off from work after working hours. You still think about it, right? And then on the next day, you're more likely to have like feelings of exhaustion and burnout on the next day. So that's what we're showing in one paper that will soon be published.
What was the reasoning behind the other paper that you mentioned, or the survey where they said people with less passion that they tend to be more a victim of burnout? What is the reason for that?
I think it goes in both directions. I think, and that's like a problem for the academic literature, but also for our society, the way that people think about passion still is like it's a very positive thing. If you exchange passion through another word like intrinsic motivation, or say that's my calling, you will think, oh, that's great, I want to have a passion for my work, I want to be intrinsically motivated and stuff like that. And these people are also most of the time people that earn more money, are more successful in their careers, have higher job performance, higher job satisfaction, and so on. And because of all of that, they're less likely to burn out. On the other hand, imagine you don't have a passion for the work that you're doing. And that actually applies to a lot of people. A lot of people are not passionate at all for their work. Maybe they have passions outside of work, but maybe they don't really enjoy what they're doing in the workplace itself. What happens is that, well, if you don't have a passion and you really don't enjoy, maybe you don't feel like you're in control of what you're doing. Maybe you don't have that sense of autonomy or mastery. Maybe it's just maybe very unsatisfying. And because of that, you're more likely to burn out. So the mechanisms are very different, right? If you're passionate and you burn out, it's because you're overworking yourself because you love what you're doing a little bit too much. But if you don't have a passion for it, maybe you burn out because of external reasons. Maybe your boss is very demanding. Maybe you're forced to work 12 hours a day, but you don't really enjoy doing it. And maybe because of that, you're burning out.
I always equated overwork with burnout, basically. But yeah, you're right. It can stem from different sources. So, what is your approach on preventing burnout and overwork? Because I imagine that you are also very busy these days. You have a lot of research going on. You were an excellent student, or you were an excellent student, and you also have your podcast. So how do you like switch off from work when you're at home?
Great question. Honestly, like I'm dealing with that like every single day because I might have mentioned it, but I also have a passion for research. So basically, every day I'm studying myself. I think one thing that's important to think about is that we need to be in charge of what we're doing. So we actually need to take control of that. And that means that if I work, let's say 80 hours a week, I don't want to say that, oh, I'm forced to do that. I'm required to do that because at the end of the day, as at least in my profession, I can decide how many hours I work. And it's like it's my decision to work very long or very few hours. And I like working a lot. And sometimes I do feel overworked. And these are the moments where I don't feel in control of my passion. And in research, again, we differentiate between harmonious passion and obsessive passion. Harmonious passion is when you're in control of your passion, but obsessive passion is when you feel like something else is controlling you, when you feel like you get lost, like you don't see where you're going and it's just happening and you lose a sense of time. So what I'm doing like actively and trying to stay in control of my passion because I don't want to be burned out when I'm 30 is like try to build multiple identities. And for me, that's like my research identity. That's my identity that I have when I spend time with family and friends. My identity when I do my podcast, when I'm organizing a conference. So there's like different topics, and I want to build all of these identities and not put everything that I have into this single one job related identity. The danger that I see when people do that is that you get emotionally dependent on that one single identity because that's who you are as a person. I could easily say, okay, I'll start as a PhD student at HBS this fall. So everything I'm doing is in order to advance my career as a researcher. However, and in research that happens very frequently, things don't really work out as you want them to work out. So what happens is that I get very emotionally dependent on the studies that I'm conducting. Maybe I have this big study and I want certain results, or at least I hope that that's like in line with my theory, and then it isn't. And then it really tracks me down. These are like the moments where I experience burnout for short periods of time. However, if you have multiple identities, you can say, okay, maybe today my day at work wasn't great, but I have these other great identities and I'll spend more time enacting those. So I guess that's like one piece of advice. Another piece of advice would be like, and it's very obvious, it's like take breaks, take vacation days, don't work too much. Because we know from a lot of research that long working hours are one of the best predictors for worse mental health outcomes. It's just a fact, right? It's like if you work 80 hours a week for longer periods of time, that's consistently related to worse outcomes in the literature. And that's easier said than done because if you have a passion, you often feel like, oh, I don't need these breaks. I can push through the day without any breaks. So it's this irony, honestly. It's like you have this passion and you feel great about yourself, but the consequences, the bad consequences, they only appear on the day afterward. And I don't know, maybe that's risky to say. I haven't tried it out really, but one thing that I've thought about recently is maybe on our most passionate days, maybe these are the best days where it's helpful to take a step back and say, okay, tomorrow is another day as well. So maybe I'll leave the office earlier than usual. Maybe that could be one possibility.
Wow, I love your approach with the different identities, and
Hmm.
also that you're honest about the fact that you yourself struggle with the burnouts, because you're like the expert in this regard. You're researching this, and even you suffer from these things. So I imagine that people who are not that immersed in this topic, they are just not aware of the fact that they might be in danger of burnout. How can I imagine that you shift your identity? Do you like wear different clothes whenever you slip into the role of a different identity? Actually, I heard some people who do that because they want to influence their subconscious mind. So, for example, like a fireworker, he puts on his fireworking clothes when he goes to the job, and then when he's home, he's putting on his jogging pants or stuff like that. So, do you do that yourself?
I don't. I've heard that very frequently though. And honestly, it's not a bad idea. It really isn't. I think the problem for me is that I work remotely a lot of the time. So I'm like sitting here and my bed is over there. So I'm in the same room most of the time of the day. So that's like what makes hybrid work or remote work tricky, right? research wise, one thing that I would suggest, my advisor wrote a paper about that, about commuting. So people usually always complain about their commute. However, commutes are actually great to transition into different roles. So you might have had a long workday, but this commute, maybe it's on the bus or maybe on the train or on the bike, it can actually help you to like stop with that one identity and switch over to your family identity, for example. I've started doing that myself, even though I'm here in the same room almost every day. One thing that I did, and that's like, I'm almost embarrassed to admit it, but one of my bad habits last year was that I like working in my bed. So I often don't get up before 11 a.m. and I was just working in my bed, and it was terrible, honestly. On New Year's Eve, I said, okay, maybe that's my New Year's resolution for this year to stop working in my bed. So far, it's been successful, and I honestly feel better that way because if you don't have these strong differentiations between this work identity and other identities, maybe we have to actively build them. Because if you change your clothes or if you are on the bus and that's like your natural commute, it can help you. But if you don't have these boundaries, as for example in remote work, you have to actually build them. And I think maybe you have ideas for that as well. But I think, for example, separating your work area from your life area is one of the most helpful things you can actually do.
But many students like myself, we live in a small room and it's kind of hard. But in that sense, I just like separated my room internally into different sections. The bed is the sleeping place, and I think kind of like you, because I also experienced that working in bed is not very productive for me, at least. I read an interesting, I think, paper about a guy during COVID who uh, they didn't go into the office but had home office like you, and he just walked around his house, like around the area, for like 3 rounds to subconsciously trick his mind into going to work in that sense, and it actually worked for him. So maybe that's something you can keep we can keep in mind too. Are you advocate of the 4-day work week? Like for example, it was, I think, introduced in Sweden,
Yeah.
and it's very controversial. I talked about this with many people, and at first glance, as an employee, it sounds very good. There are some studies that also show that it increases the productivity because people are less at risk of the burnout problem. So, what is your
Yeah.
stance on that?
Oh, it's a tricky issue, and I don't have a strong opinion on that. Um, I kind of tried to avoid this topic for a long time because I thought, oh, it's controversial. I don't really know what to think about this because it has advantages and disadvantages. I guess two things for me stand out. One thing that I really like, and that's like more work doesn't mean more output. I think that's like a lot of people talk about this, but I think it's still in our mind that we think if we clock more hours, we are better employees. That's not necessarily true. Definitely not when you're in a creative job or in a very autonomous job. On the contrary, I often experience that I have the best ideas for new research ideas, for example, when I don't work. Like when I'm on like vacation or over the Christmas holidays, I usually have great ideas for new research studies. So I feel like that's one important aspect to keep in mind, that we can do a lot of great work even when we're working less hours. However, on the other hand, I don't think personally I would be a big fan of a 4-hour work week because, and that might sound weird, but what would I do the other 3 days? Maybe I would find other hobbies. That's great. But I think personally, for me, one thing that I would prefer is actually working on 7 days a week and then working 3 or 4 hours a day. So that's like it's a different model, but I think that's a model that I would personally prefer. And I guess at the end of the day, it's just that different people have different opinions on that, or maybe different preferences. And that's like I feel like I'm just talking about research all day long, but there's this one model. It says work life segmentation or work life integration. So if you're a work life segmentator, you're trying to keep your work life and your life very different. That's, for example, if you go 3 rounds around your whole house or you change your clothes, right? You're really trying to put them separate. I would say I'm more a work life integrator. I like to make work a part of my day. Maybe that's why I've worked for a long time in my bed, and maybe that was a bad idea. But I think like research is something that I think about very often and talk about very often. And I wouldn't want to do that only 4 days a week. I actually enjoy what I'm doing. So maybe that's the positive part about having a passion. I think I would miss something. But then I don't know. I've never tried it. Maybe I would spend more time on my podcast or have other hobbies.
That's true.
What do you think about that? I'm interested to hear that as well.
It depends, and this is a
Mm.
typical lawyer answer, but like it depends on the circumstances. And I believe that less hours a day are leading to more productivity, because
Mm.
oftentimes I see myself just trying to be busy out of the fact that I believed that being busy means more output at the end. But as you said, it didn't. So I try to maximize my time, and really setting deadlines helps in that sense. But I think a little bit in contrast to you, I am not a work life integrator, because I'm not sure. Isn't the work life integrator model in contrast to the fact that we want to switch off from work
Yeah.
during home and everything? So isn't that like a little bit contradicting to that fact?
Oh, it absolutely is. You're making a great point there.
Yeah.
I think I'm more an integrator, but maybe I want to become a little bit more a segmentator. I love many benefits of like integrating my work life and my other parts of my life, but there are these dangers that we've talked about today in the episode already, like the danger of burning out or not switching off from work. Maybe the solution would be to be somewhere in the middle between segmentating and integrating.
Wow, this is really interesting, because it's so applicable to actually my daily life too. I want to cut off this segment because you also have another segment that I'm really curious about in your research, which is the power, I guess, of being extrovert. Or in other words, is extroversion necessary to become successful these days? And I don't know if it's you or one of your like papers that you read that introduced the word flextraverted, I think is the word. So yeah, can you elaborate a little bit on your position about it? Do you think extroversion is necessary to become successful these days?
Great question. So flextraversion is actually the one concept that I'm trying to introduce to the literature, but also like to our daily lives. Mm, I would identify more as an introvert myself, but especially when I'm in the US, I feel like I have to act very extroverted at sometimes because the US is a very extroverted country, in my opinion. And the first time I've ever thought about this was when I went to my first academic conference and gave a talk or a poster. And I was like, oh wow, I really have to upregulate my levels of extroversion here in order like to fit what other people may think is optimal in this situation. And yes, extroversion is great. Like, extroversion is a super strong predictor for all kinds of positive outcomes: life satisfaction, positive affect, performance. Basically, everything that's positive can be predicted by extroversion. So, extroversion seems to be a great, great, great thing. However, I always felt like there are also situations where it might be better to act more introverted. Because take this example. Imagine you're in a group discussion. Do you want to be the most extroverted person? I don't know. Maybe you want to be enthusiastic, but you also don't want to be the person that's talking at all times. You don't want to be like too much or like over the top with your extrovert. So I feel like there's kind of a skill to be able to regulate your levels of extroversion to what you think is like optimal in a given, but also across different situations. And that's how I define flextroversion. It's like being flexible in your levels of extroversion in order to fit what you think is optimal or beneficial in a given situation. So if I'm listening to you telling me about emotional problems with your partner, I have no idea. Then it might be better to be more introverted. But if I'm in a podcast episode with you, it's probably better if I'm acting like in enthusiastic and assertive ways. So it's like this regulation thing that I'm most interested in.
I see. You said you were introverted, and that surprised me because, like, as we talked, I felt like you were more extroverted, but deep down you're an introvert. So, did you practice to be more extroverted because you were forced to in this setting, in this new setting in America, or like how did you approach these kind of things for people, for example, who are really introvert and who want
Yeah.
to be more extroverted?
I actually hear that very often that people say that they think they're introverts, but other people perceive them as extroverts. So I'm definitely not the only one. But there are also other people who think of me as an introvert. It really depends on like how people get to know you. I think in these like very like presentable settings where I'm like talking about stuff that I care about, or like a podcast, I think people could even consider that doing a podcast is related to being extroverted. So it's a skill that you can learn, in my opinion. And one thing that I don't want to advocate is that everybody should be extroverted. That's why I'm trying to do research on that, because I believe that there are also situations where it's better to be introverted. But I guess in our society there are more situations where other people value high levels of extroversion. So, for example, in research, a lot of people are more introverted because research can be a lonely experience and you can be in your lab all day long and just study what you're interested in. But then most of the people, they also have to do teaching or like presenting their papers to others on conferences, for example. So academics are really a great sample to study this or to think about this, because teaching and speaking and presenting stuff to other people, that's a skill that you can learn 100%. So I did some comedy improv theater last year in Boston because I wanted to be more extroverted. And that was really, really hard for me because it was very uncomfortable. It was like way out of my comfort zone. But then I just did it because I thought, okay, maybe that will benefit me in some ways. And it certainly did. So I would recommend that to everybody doing that, doing comedy improv, even though it was not funny at all. But it's like this, it's a skill that you're trying to learn, to be in the moment, to listen what other people are saying, and then to act in front of other people. Super helpful.
Is that on YouTube anywhere?
No.
You're sure? Oh, too bad.
Yeah,
I
too
would love to
bad.
see
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, you should come to a live show, but I will make sure that it won't get recorded until I'm better.
Yeah, Kai, I think that wraps up today's episode because I respect your time and you have to go soon. I just want to summarize the things that I think I took away from this valuable talk with you today. You talked about your process in Harvard and that you should be excellent in a field, and I think that should always be the goal, to be excellent in whatever you do. Then we talked about the fact, how to turn off your work when you're at home, how to divide different sectors in your room, how to use the different identity method, so to speak, from Kai, to switch into different roles and to maximize basically your productivity in each kind of role. Then how we should prevent burnout, that we should listen to our intuition in a sense and to our gut feeling, because it shows us that, yeah, our actions are in accordance with our values. And then we talked about extroversion and the fact that it is helpful, but not in all situations, and that we should be flextraverted, which means that you should adapt to each specific situations. I think it's kind of like Bruce Lee when he said, "Be water, my friend," because water always adapts to different circumstances. So
I love that.
yeah, I think that's kind of a good quote to end this. So yeah, Kai, do you have any last comments before you leave?
Oh, I think I always talk about the dangers of being passionate about the thing that you're doing, because there's a risk of burning out. But I'm convinced that passion is a great thing, and everybody should try to build a passion for something. And it doesn't have to be at work, it can be something outside of your work too. But then try to do something that you really care about and that you're good at, rather than something that you might enjoy, because the things that you enjoy are the things that can fluctuate over time. But the things that you really care about, those are the things that are in line with your values. And I think that's more important.
That's a perfect way to end this episode. Thank you so much, Kai,
Thank you.
for joining us today.